Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Looks like we are live. I think in a few seconds I will see people joining. And we started before the scheduled time because my wonderful guest today, that I am absolutely thrilled, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart, found time to have a round table with me, which is truly an honor. One of my favorite geopolitical channels. Let me show you right here where you can find Susan Kokinda and Barbara Boyd. It's right here. The link is already in the title of our live stream, Promethean Updates, and make sure to go to the website right here, prometheanaction.com, and subscribe to those ladies to the newsletter, as well as supporting those two wonderful women. First and foremost, thank you so much, ladies, for joining me today. Really, really happy for this interaction with you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
So just to give you a little bit heads up, I think Barbara probably remembers, but Susan, you're my guest for the first time. I am currently located in Poland. I have been here since the last 3 years, and that was shortly after Poland took in millions and millions of Ukrainian refugees. But before I spent 17 years living in the United States, and I was there during the time when the 2020 election was stolen. So why I'm saying all of this? Because the last years, especially from 2020, I dived into the topics. I went into many rabbit holes, and of course, the politics are enormously important to understand what's going on in the world, and it takes you to other subjects as well. But I would like to go back to the 2016. And the reason for it is because as now we are facing the hopefully judgment time for what took place then, and Russia hoax is going to be explained in details, and I think for a long time. In my opinion, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, this is going to change enormously a lot of things in regards to how the elections has been run, just in the United States, but all around the world. This will also remove the fake so-called leaders of those governments that we have, not just in Europe, but in other countries as well. And I want to look into the issue first, because I think this is a very important thing. If there is no fair election, nothing really can be built, in my opinion, on anything solid, because they always implement whoever they want into the higher position, and they can just run things however they are told. So I heard, I'm not sure if this is the fact or if this is another conspiracy story, that of course she's supposed to win. We know who, Hillary, right? Hillary Clinton, supposed to win, and she didn't. So apparently, allegedly, that's the new popular word, there was a server in Ukraine from all of the places that somehow, again, I'm sure I don't have evidence, but somehow Russia has stopped, meaning Russia did not want the election to be stolen. Again, I might be completely off, but I heard that. So let's say this is the truth, which I tend to believe there is a high chance it could be. And I believe that Putin and Trump for quite a long time have been playing this game against the global agenda. I want you first to help my audience maybe to understand what really took place there, ladies, and how this Russia hoax can change the future of the United States as well as of other fake governments, I would say.
Well, I'll start and try and make it as it's a complicated story, and it actually goes back to the 2014 Ukraine coup. which was run by the United States and the British, to create the circumstance of a permanent war to remove Putin from Russia and to balkanize the Russian state. The reason for that is that the modern British financial empire has wanted to destroy two nations for the last, 150 years or so: the United States and Russia. Russia, because it stands at the door to Eurasia, which they'd like to actually capture all of it because of its rich mineral and other resources. So in 2014, a whole kind of new mechanism was put into place of what I'm calling total information warfare, i.e., all of our intelligence agencies were subsumed by the British intelligence agencies and became partners so that they were sort of inseparable. And the idea was, let's actually do what we did in Ukraine, which is to essentially control the media, control everything else, and run a color revolution in the United States should Hillary Clinton not be elected. Because their overall idea was, Hillary's going to get elected. She'll continue what Barack Obama was doing in terms of just causing the wholesale looting of our country and the further degeneration of our culture, which has been a more long-term project here. And if she doesn't get elected, what do we do? So back in 2015, they started profiling every single presidential candidate through GCHQ, which is the British equivalent of the NSA, or the surveillance capacities. And they looked at every single candidate, except for Hillary, obviously, because she's the favored one. And they started developing these dossiers on how do we defeat each one of them. Bernie Sanders was another one, clearly, because he was not necessarily towing the line at that point, although he was subsequently put into line. So in Ukraine, when the coup happened, the CIA moved into Ukraine and the State Department moved into Ukraine, and they perfected these information warfare capacities, including all the ones which Europeans are very familiar with to actually rig elections. So all of that arsenal was built up from the coup forward. So what happens is they figured out, okay, Donald Trump somehow is like winning the race at a certain point. It's very clear. And Hillary's got super big problems because she was using an off-the-reservation server with all sorts of classified documents in it, and therefore could be prosecuted quite literally under the espionage laws of the United States. At the same time, there was the normal kind of intelligence surveillance conducted by Russia, and they chose to target all of the key institutions, which we would say are the British backbone of their control of the United States, like the Atlantic Council, like George Soros's Open Society Foundation, like all these places. And they got all these emails out of that place, which actually showed that they knew what these governments were doing from 2015 on to run a color revolution against the American election. Okay, so now this becomes a big tug of war behind the scenes between the Russians, who know everything, and the Obama White House as to, oh my God, they know everything. What are we going to do? And they decide, we're just going to do it anyway. We're going to double down, and we're going to basically exert our power, and we don't have a choice. So we're basically going to do this thing called the coup against the presidency of the United States. And at each stage, they knew everything they were saying was BS, but they continued to do it. So on your question about the Ukrainian server, I'm not necessarily of that view. I think something very similar happened in that there is a Ukrainian hacking group called Shalte Boltai, which was actually very much tied in at a certain point with Russia. In fact, the leader of it was arrested by Putin for treason shortly after the November election. So there was a certain level of Ukrainian involvement going on in all of this. And, basically CrowdStrike, which is the firm that went in and looked at the DNC computers and everything else, is run by this guy, Dmitry Oparovich, who's former Russians. And, the Atlantic Council, the Digital Research Lab of the Atlantic Council, has been central to this whole coup apparatus of running cyber operations for purposes of color revolutions. So the fact that CrowdStrike was brought in to examine the DNC computers and John Podesta's emails, etc., leads you right back to Ukraine, leads you right back to what happened in 2014. So that's kind of the story. And I'm really insisting that the whole story has to be told, that you can't just say this is internal to the United States. It's simply a Hillary Clinton's bad woman. She did this, and Barack Obama, bad guy, he did this. You've got to go at the institutional nature of the British, policy fronts, which were actually behind this. All of the things which were run during the summer of 2016 occurred through British assets and on British, soil. Who was the Maltese professor? Who was, all of these questions which remain, but it was all done in Britain through British agents. And the reason was that we can't necessarily do these things in the United States legally, so they wanted to shove it off and create what's called plausible deniability so that they would get off the hook. And you can't really, what are you going to do? Are you going to try and extradite these people from Britain? That'd be very, very difficult to do. So that's kind of was the plan and what happened. But again, it's much deeper than what people are actually saying.
Barbara, thank you so much for explaining this. I really appreciate. Susan, I want to ask you within this topic still here, how do you think, because there are so many layers to it, how we can get rid of this once and for all? Because even if there is a justice system, right, which I think, I don't know if does this go military, it's a treason, I don't know how they're going to judge this, but this is on the global scale, Susan. How this will be taken care of and clean up?
Well, I often say it's important to remember on whose behalf the deep state and this apparatus works, because shutting down, getting justice in terms of these kinds of intelligence operations, this coup operation, is a very, very important battle. But it has to be located and won in the context of the war. Because again, the question is, on whose behalf is this operating? One of my favorite speeches that Donald Trump gave is when he came here to Michigan during the UAW strike. And he spoke to a group of auto workers, and he called on people. He said, I want you to join the ultimate strike against the globalist financier class. It's probably one of the most precise statements he's ever made in terms of the nature of the enemy. And I frankly don't think you're going to get justice in and of itself. And I think Trump understands that as well, which is why he is waging a, full front warfare against this globalist financier elite. He is reshaping the global economic infrastructure with his tariffs policies, which means he is cutting to the heart of financial flows that keep this globalist financier elite alive. He's reviving the sovereignty, the economic sovereignty of the United States with his policies. And so, I mean, I could go on, but I think it's important to always remember Trump is not just fighting this over here. He's got an understanding, perhaps not in precisely the terms that we use, but globalist financier elite is good enough for me, frankly. It's pretty darn close to what we describe as the modern day British Empire or the Anglo-Dutch imperial system and so on. He's hitting it at all of their nodal points in terms of rebuilding a sovereign economy here in the United States, using the power of tariffs and the power of the presidency to reshape the global system. As we've discussed, he's at least raising the question of the independence of the Federal Reserve. I don't think he's going to be in a position to get rid of it, not with the Congress he currently has, but he's raising questions that have really not been discussed in this way in the public square for decades, if ever. So I think he's clearly got a conception that you have to hit them on all sides at once. And I think the other important question is really the question of leadership. As we in our organization know, it's never a question of, oh, what they did is illegal, because they did a lot of illegal things to us and they got away with it. It's a question of where the power lies. Can you actually enforce your legal system properly? And the fact that you have two leaders who will not be broken in the world, President Putin in Russia and President Trump in the United States, is probably the most important dynamic in this entire thing. Because we can wave our hands about, we want justice, we want to expose this, we want to get to the bottom of this. Well, you can expose it, you can get to the bottom of it, but you're not going to get justice until you've shifted the balance of power in the world. And I think we're in the middle of that process actually taking place.
Thank you, Susan. I would like to now go into Putin and Trump. As someone who grew up in Poland during the communism era, I was, I think naturally so, almost, I don't want to say brainwashed, but conditioned, that's the right word in English. I was conditioned not to be crazy about Russia. But of course, Russia nowadays is not Soviet Union. But what I'm saying is, as someone who grew up in that kind of environment, which again, it was historical fact, the influence of the Soviet Union in Poland, unquestionable. And there were good things with it, but there was also bad things with it. So let's be honest here. I wanted to see with my own eyes how Russia really is nowadays. And I took myself on this challenge. And in 2022, in December, so we are talking the first winter of the special military operation, I went for the first time to Moscow and then to St. Petersburg. And from that moment on, when I look now, I think I spent over a year, if not more, but over a year, altogether with all my visas combined in Russia. I don't know the entire country, but I am from the Slavic country. I feel the Slavic soul, and I have a deep connection and understanding of what Russia stands for and what Russia represents. Of course, there are different people everywhere, but it's a country full of culture, values, tradition. And my perspective about Putin, I was never someone who hated Putin or thought he was the evil, not like that, but I didn't care much about him. But my perception has changed enormously. And I'm just explaining all of this because I approach relationship between Trump and Putin I don't look at what's going on the surface or what media presents. It's more intuitive approach. And I think they have been fighting this battle for quite a long time. And on the surface, it might look like, Trump is a narcissist and he is stupid, like many people call him, which I think is absolutely the farthest away from the truth. And then we have Putin, who is a different policeman type. But I would like to ask you ladies now, in this moment when we are, first we have Trump saying we are redirecting our submarines, nuclear submarines. So everyone is freaking out closer to Russia. Then we have Steve Witkoff going to Moscow and smiley faces and shaking hands. Now we have this conversation that yes, there will be a meeting and maybe in United Arab Emirates. So can you tell us, my audience, because my audience is majority of my audience is very much pro-Russia. A lot of people in my audience are not so crazy about Trump because he disappointed them. They think he is a buffoon. A lot of people trust Trump and they support Trump. So, there is the divide, of course, right? But could you please give us your take on this, and what do you expect going forward with how they operate on those two engines?
Well, I'll start because I addressed it a little bit in my Wednesday update. So we know how Trump negotiates. Look at him with North Korea. My button's bigger than yours, and so on and so forth. And before you know it, you had the first face-to-face meetings between the United States and North Korea in like forever. And of course, the neocons in our administration in the form of John Bolton sabotage that. Trump has learned a lot, by the way, since then. You're not going to find any neocons at the top levels, I think, of his administration. But, take this current period where Trump is saying, I'm moving my nuclear submarines closer, moving up the deadline in terms of a settlement, threatening secondary sanctions against countries. Now, all you have to do is actually go to official Russian statements in the middle of all of that. The foreign minister Lavrov had a very stunning statement on August 1st. So it was after the nuclear submarines and the deadline and all of this kind of stuff, basically saying, we can talk with the United States. They like us, want to get to the root causes of the crisis in Ukraine and settle it. The problem is the Europeans, who are Russophobes, and they're the ones who want to keep the war going. So I think there's absolute clarity on the side of both Russia and the United States that our aim is peace, a lasting peace, which means, obviously, as Russia has said, you've got to get to the root causes, like Nazis in Ukraine, among other things. But I don't think it's all that mysterious. I think it's just people get caught up in the clickbait headlines or the rants, or the people who lose their nerve every time somebody says something which doesn't fit into some nice, peaceful coexistence world. That's not the way the world works. And add to that, Trump is dealing with the fact that he has a Congress. He has a Republican faction in the Congress, which is, most of them are out to lunch still on foreign policy. So that's what I'd say.
I don't have much to add to what Susan said, other than, I think there are a lot of people who are invested in their websites and other things, present and really don't like the United States, to put it bluntly. There's a lot of things we have done, obviously, in the last decades, which are horrendous. But that's not what the United States is about. And what Trump is about is actually recapturing who we actually are in the world. From John Quincy Adams, we want to be the city on the hill, the exemplar for the rest of the world in terms of what human beings can achieve. And so you've got a lot of people who are commentators who like to see the world in kind of fixed terms, which they're very comfortable with. Trump is creative. He's changing things. He's upending the entire order which previously existed. And people are very uncomfortable with that kind of change. They tend to say, oh, I think that what comes from the developing nations is he's a bully. All right. He's a bully. He's bullying. All right. Well, if you're going to change the world, you better not be using diplomatic language or the polite terms that you have in a tea party. That's really not the way the world works. When you're dealing with fixed ideologies, you've got to, kick in the doors. And that's exactly what I think he's doing, and which has a lot of commentators who are very, wedded to their views of how the world works, which is not how it works fundamentally, pretty upset because of the level of change, which is very dramatic. I think Putin actually understands that, given what he's had to deal with in Russia when he kicked out all the oligarchs. That was not a nice process. All right. That was not, teacups and going into court or doing anything like that. It was a brutal process because the point was these people were out to destroy the Russian state. So, I think you've got to deal with the realities. It's like any of these war situations, all right? Very upsetting. But when you ask people, what's your solution? What would you do? How would you actually solve it? Most of them just have platitudes to say. They don't really have something concrete to offer. And in each of these cases, I think what both Putin and Trump are really geared towards is the idea is economic development above all of these, set warfare pieces, which the British put in place in many cases decades ago. Take the Middle East. They control both sides of the equation, the Muslim Brotherhood and the revisionist Zionists. All right. You're going to pick sides in that when they're killing each other. You got to figure out something above all of that to pull the hatred away from the equation. And it's a difficult process.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for this. I want to now, just came to me, but I want to address it. I have questions prepared, but I think when you just go with the flow is the most natural, healthy way to have a conversation. As I was learning about this conflict in Ukraine, and I will just go not to 2014, I will just go to Russia taking care of things in 2022. I understood that this is not just about NATO approaching too close to the borders. That's one aspect. But that was also about, I don't know, CIA or whoever was behind it, creating those laboratories that were targeting certain type of nations, right? Certain bloodlines. Donetsk region, for example, human trafficking aspect, which is enormous and hardly, I wish it had more, people pay more attention to it, because it's not just military industrial complex, it's not just the military aspect, but it's also the human trafficking aspect that is part of the same British monarchy DNA, if I can just say this way. So that was another aspect for Russia to remove those nefarious practices that were literally created to destroy the country and certain people, right? Slavic nations, etc. But then I hear other comments once in a while. This is all about the energy and who dominates, who rules over, who has the most influence and most saying in this battle between the energy in that region. Okay, we know the Ukraine has one part which is more, let's say, fruitful as far as the agriculture, but there are other aspects, and the Turkey and all those connections there. So with all of this being said, when I look at this, and by the way, just side note, but again, it's all connected. We just had 2 days ago in Poland, our new president was sworn in. This is someone, I'm sure you're aware because you follow this closely, the worldwide politics. This is someone who, in my opinion, Trump appointed clearly. I mean, he gave him thumbs up. He said, you will win. Boom, he won, right? Which again, is not because Trump said it, because he does represent, I'm not saying he's perfect, but he represents certain traditional values. And it seems like, and I feel it actually might be the case, that he will be for the Polish people. So what he will do, his presidency, I think he will definitely take care of the shenanigans in the current Polish government. However, he is also on the wanted list in the Russian Federation. Why is that? Because he demolished a lot of buildings that were the statues in honor of the Red Army who liberated Poland during the World War II. I mean, the whole history, we know how it goes. It's really, really, it's horrible, because you just want to make peace with everyone and stop, fighting. But my question here is, why do you think Putin was able not to give in to that influence from, or the domination of the British monarchy, but United States still had to be under this control, because it looks like that was a control over the country. But we know that there was corruption in Russia as well. And we also know that, this could go different way in Russia. So why do you think that Putin succeeded? Because it looks like it's still painful road, but he succeeded in that. And in US, the battle is still going on.
Well, I don't know whether Susan wants to take that up or not. I think there's a certain strength of character in Putin, just like there is in Trump. And that character goes very much into his knowledge of Russian history, Russian culture, and that's really an overlooked factor of how anybody here in the United States looks at Russia. We don't take into account Russian culture. We don't talk about Pushkin. We don't talk about, the actual strength of the Russian scientific tradition, a lot of which, comes out of Ukraine, for example, with Vernadsky, who was probably one of the most critical scientists in the entirety of human evolution. So, you have an inherent cultural strength, just like you have in the United States. And then you have the enormous sacrifices during World War II, which basically focuses a population very clearly on some sense of national mission. All right. In the United States, beginning in 1967 or so, we began to take down the space program. We very much kind of lost that sense of national mission, which was what was attacked very directly by the British Empire. They attacked the kind of frontier, what I call the frontier spirit of American culture, the idea that we are going to explore the outer boundaries of nature. And that's the new frontier. We're going to make new discoveries. We're going to have a growth in our economy and in our worldview, such as I know that I can say to my grandchildren, you're going to live in a better world than I lived in. That's the kind of can-do American attitude. If you look back, Susan can tell you a lot about what America was like during the World War II process of mobilizing to win the war through superior logistics and technology. We just turned this economy on a dime and began producing tanks and airplanes by the minute. That never happened before in all of human history. That's what the British were targeting. So if you think about the rock, drug, sex counterculture, as my colleagues used to call it, that all came in and was aimed at exactly that kind of thing and demoralizing the population. And that, in many respects, is the cause of the problem. Susan may have more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit at something really important when you talked about the sacrifices of the Russian people during World War II. Because I think that remained a much more visceral experience generationally in Russia than the World War II mobilization in the United States. In other words, we did not lose millions and millions of people on our home soil. We mobilized. But as our mentor, Lyndon LaRouche, often commented, he was a World War II veteran. He came back from World War II. And he saw that a large part of the American population just wanted to retreat from the world, catch up, have babies, live a normal life. And that left them very, very susceptible to a psychological warfare operation, which came even before the rock, drug, sex counterculture, the whole McCarthy period, which was really an early version of what they did to Trump. They established a narrative. There's communists under every bed. Turn in your neighbor if he says something liberal. And a large part of the American population really capitulated to that in the late 1940s and in the 1950s. And even though you would have a president like a John Kennedy, who would reawaken that spirit, he was, of course, assassinated. And then people, of course, hoped that you would see someone else pick up the flag, like Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy in 1968, and they were assassinated. I mean, that's where I got my start in politics. I was campaigning for Bobby Kennedy in California when he was assassinated. So I think the American population has been under a more direct, intense version of British psychological warfare. Now, obviously, you had a different situation in the Soviet Union. I'm not saying people had freedom of expression in the communist period, but I think this spirit of defending your nation was still there. And the minute Putin came in as a Russian nationalist, someone ready to defend the sovereignty of the United States, I think he had a much stronger response from his own population. Obviously, he was there before Trump quite significantly in his first administration. But I think he frankly had much more to work on earlier. I think that has reawakened in the United States, obviously, since Trump came in, since the attacks demonstrated to millions of Americans that something was going on in this country, which is not American. So I think Trump now has that same quality of national support from his population. But I think it took a little longer for it to reawaken here in the United States.
Thank you for that. And I just want to play this for a moment, because when you were talking, I have this video prepared. I'm not going to play the sound, just the image. We remember this moment, okay? When Putin gave Trump that ball, here you have Helsinki 2018. This is about the soccer, as you call it in US, football, we call it in Europe. I actually understand this in a different way. Of course, you can take it at the face value that this is, that United States is going to be, you know, now playing that game as far as soccer goes. But in my opinion, as I look at this, I think Putin was fighting with the deep state. Let's just narrow it. He was alone in this battle. If I see it the right way, I think he was fighting this for a long time. We have 2018. There comes Trump. Of course, they have communicated before 2018, in my opinion. But here, symbolically, is the ball. Now the ball is in your court. Take care of your swamp. I took care to big extent, because he's still taking care of some leftovers of his swamp. I'm sorry for, but just paraphrasing. And this is a very symbolic moment. That's why I truly believe that in a way, we cannot, especially as Trump, we cannot really take at the face value exactly what he says, because this is supposed to be confusing. This is supposed to be all over the place, because a lot is at stake, in my opinion. And I have a few more questions. The next one is about, Susan, you said this in your live stream recently, yesterday actually, about this battle between the US Republic and the British monarchy. And I would like to ask you, at this moment right now, how far, in your opinion, we are in this battle? How much more to the finish line?
Oh, I think we're a ways from the finish line. But I think for the first time in my lifetime, we're fighting the right fight. Obviously, the ability to get Trump back into office was absolutely indispensable. And I think it's going to go down in history as one of the seminal moments in history. Because for the first time, certainly in the post-war period, and we could perhaps go back even longer in American history, you have overridden the deep state operations sufficient to put this man back into office, to put him into office with at least a top tier of cabinet officials. I am not going to speak for much, below the deputy undersecretary level, perhaps, in terms of people's loyalties to Trump. But that in terms of his top cabinet levels, he really has brought in an A team which thinks like he thinks, that they are dismantling a globalist system. To be quite honest, did I think I was going to see that in my lifetime? If you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, I hope so. And now you're actually seeing it. Now, this is a big job because it involves it involves so many different fronts. You know, it involves educating the American people. The only way you're going to finish this job, and this is how Barbara and I see our role and our organization's role, is bringing people into the full historical magnitude of this fight. This isn't Democrats versus Republicans and so on. This is a continuation of the American Revolution and the battle to establish a world of sovereign nations against a global imperial system, which most modern form was the British Empire. So you're not going to win that fight until you've actually recruited enough Americans to see the fight from that standpoint. The difference between today and even Trump's first term is people understand that this is not politics. This is not corruption. Here in the United States, you know, because I'm out there, I'm active in the Michigan Republican Party, talking to people, addressing groups all the time. And there is a passion among, I can't give you a percentage, but a significant percentage of the American people, that this is a fight for our future, and I have to sacrifice for that. That did not exist before. You know, people might have been passionate about politics, but it was not existential. So we've made dramatic progress because of Trump's courage in this. I think a seminal question is going to be how you put together the forces, both at home and with partners around the world, to begin to actually dismantle the central banking system. I mean, clearly Trump is taking a sledgehammer to the system of free trade and doing a very good job at it. But behind the free trade system is the financial control of the central banking system. And that, of course, raises the question of, as I mentioned earlier, what are you going to do with the Federal Reserve? Well, I think in the short term, Trump is going to put people in there that at least will not sabotage his policies, but to continue to educate the American people so that you get the kind of Congress in the future which would be willing to take down the Federal Reserve. And to my thinking, that is going to be one of the fundamental markers of victory, is when the United States frees itself, whether formally or whether transforming it or setting up, I keep calling it a dual power institution, where the Fed's still over there, maybe just doing some minor stuff with monetary policy, but you have an entire new family of institutions which will actually finance economic development. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think that's when you're at the point of actually discussing changing that permanently in the real world, that's when you're going to be close to endgame.
Susan, can I just, Barbara, sorry, I just want to say one more thing on this. My guest before you a week ago, Tom Luongo, was actually addressing this. He said that Fed will remain, but Trump will transform Fed because he's not going to get rid of the very useful tool in a way. And I really understood this. I had like a aha moment because honestly, Susan, and again, I'm not an expert, but it's just an observer. Isn't it the true power lies there in the money because they control the monetary system. So if you weaken it, or you cannot cut it right away, but you have to slowly, gradually, in a way, change it and then miraculously replace it with something new that is better. That's how you win this battle, because they control the money. And if they control the money, that means this money controls other aspects, right? The governments, the politicians, human trafficking is the money. It's really money.
Yeah. And I know that's a very good observation that Tom made. I'm glad you mentioned it because I'm going to be on a show with him next Friday. But, you know, it's a very important question. You know, all the people that, you know, just stand there and scream, end the Fed. Well, I mean, even if you had the political power to do so, which Donald Trump does not at this point because he doesn't have a Congress ready to do that, what do you replace it with? And, as again, our mentor, Mr. LaRouche, always said, there's two different universes here. There's a money system where money rules, which is what we and most of the world have been under. And then, but what the American approach is a credit system where, to the extent that your government issues currency and credit, it's going to produce something which increases the growth of your economy, the productivity of your workforce, or as Alexander Hamilton said, there's nothing wrong with going into debt as long as you have created the means to extinguish it. In other words, you invest in a new technology, you invest in an economy-changing program like the Apollo project. It pays itself back. It extinguishes the debt. That's a credit system. We have not had a full-fledged credit system for a very long time in the United States, and obviously not since the Federal Reserve in 1913. So you and Tom are right in this, very right in this respect. You've got to start to develop an understanding of how does a credit system work? And is it going to be turn the switch off on the Fed and turn the switch on a credit system? I don't think so. But it's growing up an alternative where people begin to see, oh, there's actually a different way to run your economy. And I'm very, very convinced that this is what Trump's top tier is thinking about in terms of developing this alternate, this dual power situation.
Thank you. Barbara, would you like to add something to it?
I think Susan's absolutely right. And if there's a big debate going on, which is very, very interesting. Stephen Mirren, who Trump just appointed to the new vacant Fed chair, has advocated a process over time where the Fed is actually what he calls democratized, which is kind of a complete reform of what they're doing. He wants to end the control of the various Federal Reserve districts by the banks totally, and actually turn some of the Federal Reserves over to state governments, and return the president's power over the Fed in terms of actually being able to fire Fed people, etc. In other words, he advocates kind of a full-scale attack on this notion that this is an independent agency not responsible to the Constitution of the United States, which says the Congress is ultimately the people who control these monetary decisions. So that's a very, you see that there's this battle going on. Judy Shelton, who's another person who's being considered by Trump, is for returning to some kind of gold reserve standard as monetary policy for the entire world, which would be a great help in terms of being able to fund development throughout the world, which requires long-term, low-interest sources of credit, which we don't have now. Instead, we have these institutions like the IMF essentially sitting on top of people and saying, you will only have the following economic options, sustainable development, basically climate hysteria, and all the things which have gone along with that. So there's a huge transformation taking place here, and people are actually open to new ideas, and a completely different level of debate. Are they right? Are they wrong? I just think the debate is so refreshing to actually see that people are thinking once again, as opposed to falling in line. That basically, we're just in a very, very exciting period of history.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, the schooling system was created to create workers, not thinkers, right? That's one thing. And Sheldon, I think she's very much pro precious metals. She loves gold, as I remember. And another thing, when I think IMF is, yeah, we will destroy you and then we will come with the solution. So we will help you out. How I think at this point, even someone who is not an economist, like I'm not, or a political expert, I'm not, but you just need a little bit, like take a deep breath, look at what's going on, use your intuition, have some common sense, and maybe connect few dots if you cannot connect all the dots, because I don't think we ever can. But I have a few more questions, and I really, really want to ask those questions, ladies. I want to ask you what I struggle with as far as Trump goes, because clearly, hate me or not, I really don't care at this point. I support Trump because I understand from my perspective what's at stake. However, as I can even understand some game being played with supporting Ukraine as far as military equipment and other things of that nature, I see it as a game. I'm not saying this is right, but I look at it as a game. What I struggle with, and I really mean it, is the situation in Gaza, okay? I'm not saying that terrorists are not a problem in the world, but a child who has no food to eat, I mean, we don't even have to go there. We know what's going on. This is something that I truly struggle with. So my question is, and I would like to hear from you, because I really respect your opinion. How would you explain that? How do we understand this? That, you know, Trump has this power in that moment, months ago, to say, stop that. Okay, like stop it. That's it. No more bombing. No more attacking. Let's finish this. But that still, there was a ceasefire. I remember that. But then Israel continued, and then another situation happened again, and then the project to rebuild it, which, okay, I understand rebuild it, but people can question it. This is not about rebuilding. This is about ownership, taking over the place, remove all the Palestinians. I struggle with that region and with this situation. Can you help me out to understand that?
I think you got to step back and understand that this is a religious war. And I underline that. I underline it, you know, over and over and over again. You had in Europe the 30 Years' War, which was an intractable religious war. Now, there's lots of sides to this, you know, which people get hung up on. Is there an Israeli lobby? Yes, there is. You know, you have to take a look at the history of the region. Remember that the British originally sided with the Arabs for the destruction of Israel. All right. So it's not like black and white like people would actually have it. In Israel, from Israel's standpoint, Hamas has declared that they want to destroy Israel. That is a declaration which is backed up by terrorism and arms. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood, which is historically a British intelligence-controlled entity which has wreaked havoc throughout the Middle East. The reason is that as long as I've got these two, you know, cults, what I call religious cults, revisionist Zionism and radical Islam, neither of which have anything to do with either the Jewish religion or with the Muslim or, you know, the history of that religion. As long as I can have them fighting, the nationalist sentiments in the area are absolutely destroyed. And in fact, that's been what's happened in the Middle East for the last centuries. Every time there's a nationalist kind of upsurge of people who actually want to be nation states in the Arab world, it was crushed. And we set up these religious theocracies. Why? You know, for purposes of the fact that we want the oil and we want all of those routes which go through the area for trade to benefit us, i.e. the modern British Empire. So we have constant low-level, low-grade religious warfare taking place. What Trump says is everybody should join the Abraham Accords. All right, that's his latest iteration of trying to solve this. And he says, you recognize Israel. You stop saying we're going to destroy Israel. All right, if you stop saying that, then we can talk about how do we actually do economic development. That's been a problem. There were the Oslo Accords, all right, which were fine and dandy when Prime Minister Rabin and everybody else came in and actually negotiated between Arafat and Rabin, the Oslo Accords to make a new Palestinian state. But they handed the control of the process over to the IMF. So that we were saying, no, get the shovels in the ground, get the shovels in the ground, start the development. You have to do that. That didn't happen. And Rabin was assassinated. And you're right back at ground zero in the religious war. Friedrich Schiller actually addressed this in his trilogies concerning the 30 Years' War in Europe, and it's very instructive for people to read. And I would recommend it highly to you because it gets you off of the immediate emotional problem you run into when you look at this situation and the propaganda on both sides. Hamas showing that hostage starving, all right, was the most insane thing they could have done from the standpoint of a peace process. That it invokes almost automatically the remembrance of the Holocaust. You know, that's what they created in terms of thinking about, am I really going to go for peace? And Trump is saying no, because Hamas realizes that once they release those hostages, they don't have any more cards to play. I would argue that the October attacks by Hamas, which started this whole most recent round, were an enormous and stupid attack on the Abraham Accords, which were beginning to solve the entire problem. So you have to ask yourself, if you're, and believe me, I believe that Netanyahu is destroying Israel. All right, that's my fundamental belief. I believe that he is, acting in a way which is horrible. All right. But I also don't let Hamas or any of the Arabs off the hook for this either. Where are the Arabs in terms of coming in and supporting what's been happening with the Palestinians? Nowhere, because they don't want any more Palestinian immigration into Arab countries. So the whole thing is a mess, a historical mess that the dynamic within it is one of religious warfare. And you start picking sides in that without actually going back to what's the cause of this? What are the actual belief systems of the proponents here? Hamas is a terrorist organization. It basically supports, it is the Muslim Brotherhood annex. All right. It was supported originally by Netanyahu and by Ariel Sharon. For what reason? Because the Palestinian Authority was trying to create a nationalist Palestinian state. And these guys are Islamic fundamentalist revolutionaries. And they can keep a religious war dynamic going from the standpoint of occupying Palestine. The area right now, in terms of what everybody is talking about, Trump taking over, it's a no man's land. What are you going to do? Wander? I mean, if you look at the horrible pictures coming out of there in terms of the devastation, which has already been created, how human beings could live amongst this rubble is ridiculous. So you're going to have to figure out a way to actually get the population into some kind of safe condition. So it's a mess. All right, briefly,
Barbara,
and I struggle with it too. But I also come back to, what is this? How was it created? Why has it gone on for so long? Why are we arguing about, if you look at the negotiations which have gone on in Oslo and every place else, we're arguing about 2, 3 inches, 4 inches of land in many cases. It's just ridiculous. So the point is that, somehow we've got to get a development perspective into this. I think Russia can play a significant role. Most people don't realize that there's a huge Russian immigration into Israel of Russian Jews. And Putin is very aware of that. Russia, which would surprise many people, has very good relationships with the Israeli government. And I think that, basically this latest move, is based on, of actually saying we're going to go into Gaza City, could very well cause a civil war in Israel itself, because the population is really up in arms about it. But that's not what you want at all in a country which has nuclear weapons. So, it's a very, very complex situation, to say the very least. And, there's no kind of edict that you're going to be able to issue to say, stop this. Trump had it almost under control in his first term with the Abraham Accords. And, basically there was all kinds of momentum because there's a new generation of leaders in the Arab world who want to see development, who don't want to inherit this horrible picture from their ancestors of permanent warfare. But then what happened is Biden came in and, basically destroyed the Abraham Accords, destroyed all the momentum which was going on, which is critical. And now we are where we are. And, basically what was about to happen is the Saudis were ready to come into the Abraham Accords. And that's why, I think that entire, October 22nd incident, which kicked all this off, happened, was to stop all momentum towards an actual peace. So that's how I look at it. My heart is torn just like yours is, but I also know enough to know that you can't let your heart, carry you through in a situation like this. You've got to step back, have a cool head, and actually try and analyze, where do we take this next in terms of trying to get it at a higher level? And it is a major struggle.
I appreciate this, Barbara, but I have to tell you, I appreciate this very much, what you said, but I really struggle with this as just a simple way of looking at it. How you can justify truly genocide, and how you can say that every child, I forgot what age they mentioned, 3 or 5, is a terrorist. Again, I'm not pro this, I'm not pro that, but how can you say that there is Hamas terrorist in this hospital, in that school, in that building, everywhere, in every canal? Is just ridiculous to me. So the question is, after Gaza, what's next? Because clearly this is a target for some reasons, next to the sea, easy to transport, submarines, Maxwell, who knows? I mean, the story, but what's next? Because this destruction, it continues. We have other issues. I'm not going to talk about Syria and other regions, but it's just ridiculous. Like, no one will tell me that there is that many Hamas terrorists in every corner of Gaza that you have to smash it to the ground. I'm just not buying that.
Well, that's the Israeli line. And I think the important question is, people would like to think Donald Trump can wave a magic wand and issue a decree and tell Bibi Netanyahu what to do, for example. I mean, as Barbara said, let's not forget, Israel has nuclear weapons, and there's a subtext out there in terms of Trump's bombing of Iran, is that he did it in a very surgical, non-casualty oriented way to prevent Israel from using nuclear weapons in Iran. Is that true? I have no idea, but that's certainly not out of the question. So, there's a phrase in geopolitics, which is breakaway ally. Trump is dealing with the fact that Israel could become a breakaway ally and could start throwing nuclear weapons around the world. So the question is, and I cannot give you a full answer, what can Trump actually do? And not just in the short term. I was out organizing at a street fair here in Michigan and had a very intense discussion with a man with Mideastern background. He said, I voted for Trump, but he was expressing precisely the same things you were saying. And he said, I want it to stop right now. I said, but what if you stop it right now and it happens again in 2 years, someplace else? I think what Trump is trying to do is stop, as the Russians insist in terms of Ukraine, we have to get to the root causes of this and shut this thing down permanently. And, and Trump is dealing with, number one, a potential breakaway ally in Israel. He's dealing with, the globalist apparatus, which wants to keep this thing going. And then look at his situation in the United States. The Senate and a large part of the House Republican caucus has been adamantly, religiously pro-Israel. Now, what's interesting is that is beginning to change. And again, I think you have to look at this whole thing, not just from the standpoint of this is happening and I wish this were happening, but how do you actually change it? The political situation in the United States is changing in the sense that a growing section of the MAGA movement is finally getting their heads out of the Israel, above all else, and is actually realizing that there's more to it than some Christian fundamentalist, we have to, save Israel because the Bible tells me to. People are becoming much more sophisticated and realizing, well, what is Israel? You have the Netanyahu faction. Now you have the military saying we don't want to occupy Gaza. You have huge peace demonstrations in Israel. I think people are beginning to get much more sophisticated in terms of understanding this is not the black and white world, whether you think, the good side is the Palestinians against whom genocide is being committed, and it is, or whether you think the good side is Israel because God has ordained them and they're under attack by the infidels and so on. I think people are finally getting out of that and realizing, as Barbara indicated, this is a much more complicated situation in one respect, in terms of how many things have been set in motion over the decades, literally over the centuries. I mean, if you want to go back to one of Donald Trump's problems, Christian fundamentalism and this complete unthinking support for Zionism, for revisionist Zionism in Israel, was a British concocted ideology in the United States going back to the 19th century. You're dealing with these kinds of things. And fortunately, I think things are changing in the United States so that Trump at least has a little more maneuvering room politically, at the same time he's trying to deal with all the strategic sides of this.
So sorry to interrupt you, but I just had another aha moment as you were talking. Is British monarchy behind the creation of AIPAC as well?
Barbara, that's yours.
Look, I mean, this gets into a lot of stuff that goes on in the internet with the view that the Rothschilds control everything, and the Rothschilds are the bankers to the Queen, etc. In reality, the British Empire has all kinds of WASP names and very few Jewish names actually attached to it. The Jews have actually played a role throughout. I love the title, for example, of Richard Poe's book, which is How the British Created Communism and Blamed the Jews. It is a very interesting take on the whole issue of that ideology.
All history is fake at this point.
So, it's a very good and thoroughly documented case he makes around precisely that. When you look at the Middle East, you got to think about Tony Blair was in charge of this for the West for the last period through, being the guy who was the emissary to the so-called quartet. So you have this, and British tendencies on both sides, historically are much stronger than anything the United States has ever, thought about doing in the area when you actually look at it. Leonard LaRouche basically said that you can't solve this between the warring parties. You need an intervention completely from the outside of the Middle East. You need China, you need Russia, you need the United States essentially coming in with proposals to develop the entire area and make that concrete right away. Get the shovels in the ground, start building an alternative future for these people, which is what Trump talked about when he made that a little bit, in my view, a little bit, whoa, what are you doing proposal, essentially saying these people need a life. And that's true, and I think that's his overall directionality, but you're dealing with all the things we've mentioned here, which make it very complicated. And I think, you've got a huge upheaval going on right now in Israel because Netanyahu has two choices in front of him. The occupation of Gaza that he's now talking about could very well kill the hostages, at which point he's dead. in Israel. He's over with. He's gone. All right. On the other side, he's got the radical crazies who are in his government and are holding the government up. And they're saying, if you don't do this, basically you're dead and your government falls. All right. So he's made the choice to go with the crazies, but the army is resisting and saying, the probability of going into the 25% of Gaza we don't really control, it's likely we'll kill the hostages. So, that's a very fraught situation, to say the least. And there's a revolt going on in Israel about all of this for the first time, really, because people live in an environment in which they're terrified, every single day that there's going to be somebody shooting at them, on both sides of the equation. LaRouche said, look, these people hate each other. They've hated each other for generations. There's not, peace, love, and coexistence here. There's hatred. And you've got to somehow come into the situation from the outside and, apply what we would call a little bit of love to all sides of the equation. So that's how I would struggle with it. As you say, I'm struggling with it all the time, every single day.
Barbara, perhaps you could take the APEC question and take it back to the Anti-Defamation League.
we got nailed by the ADL as an organization way back when, because what happened is LaRouche was invited to the Middle East to talk about development by the Ba'ath governments and by Abba Eban's faction in Israel. And as soon as he came back from that trip, in which he proposed all sorts of wonderful development projects for both Israel and the Arab nations, the ADL started calling us anti-Semites and began to really campaign against us. So they function basically as an arm of Israeli intelligence and also as an arm, at that point, of the FBI and the CIA. They're one of the cutouts that are actually used for an enforcement mechanism. What we were saying and doing was obviously not anti-Semitic. It was, let's actually cure this problem, which is what he had in mind. So we had a long struggle with the ADL. And we were slandered all over the place as political, this is like Donald Trump, political extremists, anti-Semites.
Yep.
The whole deal.
This is the whole, yep. And I'm sorry again to interrupt you, but someone told me that that organization is sect. And when I hear those kind of things, I'm like, okay, this is very interesting, actually, because especially when you read the Wikipedia, hardly ever truth unless you can really verify, right? But that's how they create the description. That's how they create the narrative. So the first thing you see when you research it is that.
Yeah, well, it all came from the British run Episcopal Church in New York City, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, who we interviewed, and he said, "Oh, LaRouche just got back from the Middle East. All these proposals, we're going to paint him with the anti-Semitic brush." That's what they said, and that's what they did.
Not creative at all, Barbara, I say. And my last question, actually, I have two more. I hope I can ask you this. I really want to. Yesterday in your live stream, Susan, Barbara was describing the globalist agenda. And Susan said, let's not forget that the World Economic Forum was created. I remember because I listened to on my headphones today. I was taking a walk. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know it. That World Economic Forum was created in 1971, right? If I'm correct, you said. And that was when Nixon removed took dollar away from the gold standard. And I said to myself, I have to ask you about the European Union. Because as you know, Poland is part of this amazing Euro co-host project. So can you please tell us, the European Union ladies, how do you see this? I am trying to be humorous because, it's not funny. It's not funny at all. But I think the clock is ticking. And do you think how much Trump has really saying in this? Ursula the Witch, as I call her, von der Leyen, has signed this amazing deal for US, of course, with Trump, not so much for the EU. How do you see it? Do you see that EU is going to crumble, or is still gonna breathe for a few more years?
Well, I'm not intimate enough with the internal politics in Europe, but I think Trump has a very clear conception. I've mentioned this a couple of times. I was very surprised when he was at, I think it was the NATO summit. Yeah, because the G7 was in Canada. The NATO summit was in Britain. And afterwards, with standing there next to Starmer, he's talking about how the first time he went to NATO, he wasn't happy. And this time he was so impressed by the patriotism that he saw in the faces of the leaders there. Now, give me a break. Donald Trump knows better than that. But what was he saying? He's signaling. I mean, people have to really pay attention to what Trump is doing. He's saying, I want to work with sovereign nations. I don't want to work with globalist institutions. And obviously the European Union was, a very long project in the path to getting rid of all sovereign nations. So this is the European subset of it, basically, where you surrender primarily your economic sovereignty to supranational institutions. So I think the more that Trump is able to wield the power of tariffs, smashing to smithereens the free trade system of the globalists and so on. I mean, I think it's also kind of ironic. Britain got a better deal in the tariffs. They got 10% than the European Union, which got 15%. Now, some people said, oh, Trump is, doesn't understand the British and so on. No, he dealt with Starmer as the head of a sovereign nation. Now, I mean, we can get into the role of the UK and, the entire British imperial system and so on. But Trump is trying to set a standard. If you're a sovereign nation, I will go at it with you mano a mano. If you're actually representing your people and I'm representing my people, we're going to figure out the best mutually beneficial deal that we possibly can. But when he's dealing with supranational institutions like the European Union, it's a completely different kettle of fish. So, I mean, there's a certain demonstration there to the people of Europe. The European Union its alleged reason for being was to give you a stronger negotiating position. Well, that didn't work. So do you really need it? And the more you see the rise of nationalist leaders in Europe, of some form or another, like in Poland, like in Italy, and so on, you create an environment where you get more leaders like that. I can see an evolution away from the European Union. What time frame it is, I'm not sure anybody could even project that. But it's there. I think there's certainly an intention by Trump that it's more than an intention. It's an explicitly stated policy. A world of sovereign nations. He doesn't like institutions like the European Union or any other of these combinations. And I think he's being very surgical in terms of which ones he's weakening, first. And I think he's delivered a couple of body blows to the European Union recently.
Thank you. Barbara, would you like to add something to the European Union? Euro co-host, we call it.
Not really. I think Susan kind of covered it. I mean, it basically arose right after the wall fell, when you think about it, in terms of, the whole campaign which was run where the Germans were talking about, we want to work with Russia, namely Primakov, to actually develop Eurasia. And originally what happened is that Kohl resisted the Maastricht Treaty because he wanted to do that. But they assassinated, the bankers with Deutsche Bank who were associated with that, and his close friend, and he was beaten into submission. And hence you have this horrible kind of supernatural institution, again, coming back to Eurasia as the central, core concept within British geopolitical strategy. They want it and they will do anything to get it. and basically turning most of Europe into a vassal state for them, which is really what the EU is, even despite Brexit. That's sort of what happened. But it was a major battle. I don't discount the battle that took place with Germany trying to come forward with the idea that we'll take our economic power and essentially try and develop with Russia the East Bloc and Eurasia. And that got smashed by Margaret Thatcher and by the British in what was just a vile, awful offensive.
So my last question is, I would really like to know, have you been always supporting President Trump before even he was a president? Or when was the moment that you saw the big picture? Because clearly you see the big picture.
Well, I'll start. My husband still holds it against me, and it's okay. In 2016, I wrote in Lyndon LaRouche. But it became pretty clear immediately, once he was, literally the nanosecond he was elected, that this was something very, very different. And the fact that he came under the immediate attack that he did from the very same people who had attacked us for decades and decades, that sort of sealed the deal. But I will not lie. In 2016, I wrote in Lyndon LaRouche.
I grew up as a Democrat. I always was. My family was a deeply Democratic Party. And I never thought that a Republican could ever cause a revolution in the United States. I also wrote a terrible article about Donald Trump based on, all of the things which you can read about him or could read about him, in his early history. He was very close because of how building works in New York City, which is a whole story in and of itself, to Roy Cohn and certain people who came after our organization. So I had a very jaundiced view of him, although, the more I looked into why he was allied with those people and how do you actually get things done in New York City to build things, it became very clear to me that I was wrong by looking at connectos as opposed to looking at the actual process. So I started to think about it differently through his political campaign, and I voted for him in 2016. But I've never lived down that article. People still actually circulate it saying, "See, you were right at one point, and now you're completely off the deep end." So I think it's kind of funny. But that was all based on what you can find in connecting people up without really understanding the dynamics of the process. And that's a really important lesson, because I think a lot of the opposition to Trump is based on what I call connectos, as opposed to, really thinking about what is actually going on in this situation if I'm trying to build a building in New York City. I'm trying to get something done, in other words, which is really how he operates and how he thinks.
I'll also add, we can put ourselves in good company with J.D. Vance, although we came over a lot faster than J.D. did.
Ladies, it was truly, truly great to connect with you, and you were very generous with your time. We went much over 1 hour, so I so deeply appreciate. And yeah, I'm just very grateful that I had this opportunity to connect with both of you, because I'm always learning new things. Like today, I learned a lot of new things. And we see what the next, hopefully we connect again in the future, what the next conversation will be about, because a lot is going on, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of new topics to cover. I wish you a lot of good energy, health, be safe wherever you are, because there are crazy people everywhere, but there is a divine protection too, and keep on fighting the good fight, because that's why I think we show up for it in this lifetime. Everyone has their own little mission to fulfill. We just have to show up and participate. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Anna.